My wife Ivy has this illness. It's kind of weird. She goes on these diets that go on forever, and then...
What happens when you love someone who hates themselves more than they love you? About a month or so ago, I made a video where I ranted about NieR Replicant. It's really not a good video, but that is beside the point. In it, I mentioned that many people don't understand something obvious until a piece of art asks them to understand it, usually by weaving a genius narrative that forces the experiencer to have an moment. Senua's Sacrifice is a good example of this. I remember seeing comments under YouTube videos about the game that read something like, "This game helped me understand the hell schizophrenics are going through." Of course, most people understand that psychosis is hell, but Senua's Sacrifice ramps its immersion levels up to 300%, crafting an experience that puts you squarely in the frightening shoes of psychosis. You can't look away from it. The experience of the game is psychosis. It cannot be ignored or brushed aside. Many of the game's mechanics are symptoms of psychosis, such as voices helping you figure out puzzles, going into focus mode, and using your perception to suss out false walls and such. Another example is Edward Hopper's Nighthawks. I don't know about you, but when I look at this work, I am reminded of how alone we can be with others, an obvious and uncomfortable truth we like to push away. Every once in a while, a video game teaches me something important about life. If you watch my channel regularly, then you know my feelings on a game called NieR Automata, which I continuously say taught me the meaning of life. Because of my experience with NieR Automata, I appreciate my life. I know I would never end it, and I appreciate my fellow man, even when they annoy the living shit out of me. A video game made me a better person. That is what I'm saying here. NieR Automata is a rare example of something creative that fundamentally changes almost everyone who encounters it. It has universal themes that every human being can relate to. Questioning your meaning in the world, isolation, seeking purpose, loss of loved ones, identity, an endless cycle of suffering, also known as life. These are many things that people have struggled with. The game weaves these concepts together in a way one simply cannot ignore. And to top it off, it boasts one of the greatest endings in video game history. Many video games can cause someone to self-reflect and change, to evaluate their choices, and even become a better person because of it. They can have a profound impact on the individual, the way art is supposed to. It's why I'll never hesitate to say that video games are art. There is a popular quote I'm reminded of when I think about the game this video is about. Art is supposed to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. And if I had any questions about being one of the disturbed, my experience with Downfall has, without a shadow of a doubt, reestablished that I am. Because despite the dark tone of this game's narrative, when I finished it, I felt better. I felt like I learned something. I felt changed. I am a mentally ill person. I am diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a combination of schizophrenic and mood disorder symptoms. This disorder has caused not only me pain, but pain to the ones who love me, my friends, family, romantic partners, everyone. Even past roommates have had to watch me crash and burn before. It's not a pretty sight, and beside that, my past instability has caused me to be a pretty horrible person towards people I love. What I'm saying is mental illness is a fucking monster, one that doesn't rest, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't take breaks, it doesn't relent. It's always there stalking, waiting, watching. My mental illness has caused nothing but harm to my life. It's not cute, quirky, it isn't a blessing in disguise, it isn't anything like that. It is exhausting and trying, and it causes pain and suffering for everyone involved. And because of this, I have nothing but sympathy and respect for people who have fallen in love with the mentally ill and vow to be there through thick and thin. Mental illness isn't easy. In fact, most people won't want to deal with you when you have a full-on breakdown. I've had one person who claimed they were my friend basically throw me away because I became too much. This person even admitted that my problems became worse because of an abusive relationship, but extenuating circumstances don't matter when someone has become a liability in one way or another. And I don't blame them. As I said, mental illness is rough for all parties involved. But this video isn't about me feeling sad because this illness has cost me friends. It isn't about my feelings of anger or anything like that. It's about the other side of mental illness. You see, I just talked spitefully about a person who, in my view, is an unempathetic asshole. But from their perspective, I was a ticking time bomb, making everything worse. You see, it's easy for us to hold anger and hate towards other people when we don't understand their position. It's easy to dig your heels in and feel resentment when you can't fathom the perspective of the other side. While writing these notes, I thought of this question. What is it like to love someone like me? Someone whose self-loathing consumes them and makes them a different person. What is it like to love someone who could one day become a stranger? Downfall originally came out in 2009 and started what looks to be quite a fascinating and well-done franchise called The Devil Came Through Here. In 2016, Downfall received a remake that fleshed out the story of Joe Davis a bit more, with additions to the story to complement The Cat Lady, a game of the same franchise that came out in 2013. Full disclosure, I hadn't heard of any of these games until recently. A YouTuber I like who does playthroughs of indie games happened to play The Cat Lady all the way through, leaving absolutely no stone unturned, which intrigued me. Downfall's protagonist, Joe Davis, shows up in this game, but his sequence is difficult to understand, and it piqued my interest as well. Because of my lack of knowing any lore dealing with Downfall, even that little blurb in The Cat Lady didn't tell me much. All I could see was that Joe was extremely disturbed. The trailer for the game gave me some Silent Hill 2 vibes, and oh fucking boy, was I more spot on than I thought. Denial is a main theme of Downfall. Joe has fallen so deep in denial, nothing he believes even remotely resembles reality. I engaged in very minor research for this video. I watched a few trailers, played through the game multiple times, searched for interviews, and I found the Harvester Games website. This video isn't going to be a deep dive into the deep meaning of everything in the game or how the game was made, but rather me talking candidly about why this game personally affected me the way it did. In my research, seriously, it only took about 15 minutes before I realized I wasn't going to find much. I came across an interview with the voice actor for Joe Davis in the 2016 remake. I believe the character was originally voiced by the brother of the creator. When asked how he would describe Joe Davis, he said this: Joe means to do what's best, but I feel like he has a severe lack of impulse control and planning. To put it lightly, the guy makes some pretty bad snap decisions and has to find a way to deal with the consequences. I think there is a little bit of Joe Davis in all of us. We all want to find ways to justify the bad things we've done. We all tell ourselves little lies to justify our actions. The big difference is Joe doesn't seem to have much control over how far he'll go to cover up his own deeds. The lies he tells himself are so far from the truth, it's driven him mad in a way. I think with the right circumstances, we can all end up in denial as far as Joe is in Downfall. Fortunately, very few of us are ever in such dire circumstances. While playing Downfall, I felt something I can't quite explain the entire time. I wasn't exactly unsettled, but I was by no means settled either. Like most people, the disturbing tale that mirrors the twists and turns of psychosis stuck with me. As someone who suffers from psychosis, I could see the mental illness writing on the wall a million miles away. Like a lot of indie horror games, this one has you engage in morally questionable behavior. Behavior you want to have a choice against, but you don't. Joe has his own motivation, and your moral sensibilities, your need to pick the decent responses, none of that matters. Who Joe Davis really is? Well, he's a monster, a tried and true one. This is foreshadowed early on. I mean, even the cat in the beginning didn't like him, and when Ivy said she didn't want ice cream, he tried to force her to get it anyway. And this foreshadows something else horrific too, and I'll get more into the prologue in a moment. But the more I played, the more sympathy I felt for him. Let me explain. Mental illness is difficult to deal with. It can change the person you love into someone unrecognizable, both mentally and physically. Loving someone who cannot comprehend why they deserve your love hurts. It's painful. It's difficult to understand. It's tiring. It wears on you. Imagine telling your partner you love them and they say, "Why? I don't deserve it." Imagine watching the person you love harm themselves every day with cruel words. Imagine someone you love become a shadow of their former selves, dwarfed by their own self-hatred and misery. Imagine speaking the truth over and over and being told those truths are lies. That is what watching someone you love suffer with mental illness can be like. Now, what if that mentally ill person physically harmed themselves, like cutting themselves or throwing up their food? How would you handle that? Could you handle that? If you couldn't, it's okay. Most people cannot. It's in our nature to avoid people and things that make our life less convenient. But what if you already loved them and were forced to see them deteriorate, again, both mentally and physically, every day? There are many among us who would call it quits, others who would have never put themselves in the position to begin with, and then there are people like Joe. The weight of it all made him snap. Joe wasn't exactly stable to begin with. When he was a child, he witnessed his younger brother die in a horrific manner. On top of this, his mother offed herself due to it, and his father had no qualms telling Joe that his little brother, Robbie was his name, was the favorite. Joe blamed himself for his brother's death and his mother's suicide, and so did his father. It is no secret that trauma makes mental illness worse. If Joe was already fucked in the head, which perhaps he was, the deaths of his brother and mother served only to make his issues worse. If he didn't have any issues to begin with, well, he sure did after those two events. Like, here's the PTSD you ordered, shipped direct. As previously mentioned, Joe's father didn't have any issue blaming Joe for these things. I know exactly what it's like growing up in a household where one sibling is favored and it ain't you. I also know what it's like to lose a sibling and know that your family likely wish it was you instead. This alone caused me to feel sorry for Joe. Ivy and Joe first met when they were kids, but due to the trauma of Robbie dying during this fateful meeting, both Joe and Ivy likely pushed the event into the back of their minds. Later in life, Joe and Ivy met again, and he recognized her, but she didn't seem to recognize him. And just a side note here, he never told her that he remembered meeting her as a kid. He even had a perfect opportunity to do as such during a particular conversation, but he chose not to. And just putting this out here, that's fucking weird. There are a lot of things about Joe that just don't sit right with the player, and this is one of them. It's small, but worth noting. Anyway, they got married, and everything was fine until it wasn't. In the beginning of the game, Joe and Ivy have taken a trip to help remedy their marital problems, a little weekend getaway to clear their heads. This goes tits up rather quickly, as when Joe wakes up the next morning, Ivy is missing. To his dismay, she is nowhere to be found, and the hotel has turned, a little demonic since the evening before. And this is when the madness of downfall begins. In his desperation, Joe swears he will do anything to bring his wife back, and man, he really means anything. The manageress informs us that a girl named Sophie has taken Ivy away. And just another side note here, I assume the manageress's title is intentionally gendered to emphasize what she eventually seems to represent: the sexual part of Ivy and or Joe's sexual frustration with his wife, who likely became less sexually attractive to him with the progression of her illness. Woo, it's getting a little Silent 2 up in here, right? Somebody open a window. You'll also note the way the manageress talks about Ivy, an ungrateful bitch who ruined his life. Makes you wonder if that's Joe's true thoughts deep down. Before I continue, I want to point out that this game puts a huge emphasis on small details, and it is in those details that we find magnificent storytelling. The hotel room Joe and Ivy get has 2 single beds, not a double bed. During gameplay, you're given the option to tell the manageress that 2 single beds is not okay because you and your wife always share a bed or some shit. Like, it's really petty, but again, it tells you something about Joe. If you examine Joe's bed in their hotel room, he says something like, "This is not okay. Ivy has always slept on my left side every night." It's little, but there's obsession and maybe a bit of a controlling nature being revealed here. Very quickly in the game, we meet young Sophie, a girl who claims she is nothing more than a memory, though she fails to mention whose memory she is. Geez, I wonder if that's going to be important later. The manageress pointed us in her direction, and after an unfortunate, though seemingly required in indie horror games, cat murdering sequence, we get to the key to her room. There's a bit of a back and forth, and this is when she point blank tells us that Ivy is hiding away from Joe. It seems like a one-off, but it isn't. Joe even asks why Ivy would want to hide from him. And it's like, motherfucker. Sophie tells Joe that Ivy has been taken into a mirror, and in order for him to get her back, he must murder 4 versions of Sophie, memories, which will crack the mirror and allow him to find his wife on the other side. One thing to note here is that every mirror in the game is broken. There are 2 narrative reasons for that. It keeps Joe from seeing who he truly is, and the other is what I'm about to cover right now. From the moment we meet Ivy, it becomes obvious that something is off. She's sitting outside of a diner while her mom eats inside. Now, I don't know about you, but when my guardians went out to eat, they didn't force me to sit outside. Something is way off about this. Again, these little details stand out to the player, as they should. Ivy explains that she's on a diet and waiting for her mom to finish eating. Joe convinces Ivy to come with him. It is during this sequence we get our first glimpse of Joe not listening and being pushy. They go to get ice cream, and Ivy says she doesn't want any because of her diet, and there are several dialogue options Joe has that serve to show his personality. He asks her, "What's the matter? Don't you like ice cream?" and "Why not?" amongst other things. Ivy is adamant that she doesn't want ice cream, but instead of listening, Joe's dialogue options make you choose what kind of ice cream to get her. That's right, even as a kid, Joe shows how he can be controlling. He clearly didn't respect Ivy's wishes, causing her to run off. When Joe finds her, and this is really important, she apologizes to him, saying, "Sorry, I freak out sometimes." There is a pattern of mentally ill people apologizing for their existence, and that is a really important thing I want to note here. Shorter story shorter, Joe's little brother comes back and he gets blown up right in front of Joe and Ivy. And that's the prologue. So immediately we see a dynamic between Joe and Ivy. He's pushy, she's quiet. He doesn't listen, she gives in and apologizes. There isn't much interaction we see between Ivy and Joe as adults, but it's pretty easy to assume that this dynamic persisted, especially when you notice a few of the dialogue options offered by the game. It gnawed at me just how often Joe's options were terrible, and in some cases, none offered were what I'd call good. As you might have guessed, Ivy's relationship with food grows worse and becomes a central theme of the game. During a flashback in the game, Ivy confesses to Joe that she's been making herself sick, throwing up her food, and it is here that I began to feel my heart sink. Joe's dialogue options can be either supportive and caring or mean and berating. On my first playthrough, I chose the kinder options, where Joe says things like, "You're not even fat. You're the most beautiful girl in the world. I love you. I'll help. We can beat this together." Without going into great detail, I will tell you that this conversation was almost word for word conversations I've had with my partner. I couldn't stop thinking about how much it was hurting Joe to hear Ivy basically tell him he's a liar. Because in this case, Ivy was me, and I had been telling my partner, who incidentally has a name starting with J, that nothing he said was true and he was a liar. I'm ugly, I'm disgusting, I'm unworthy of love, and nothing he says could change that. There are a few times in this game that Ivy says things I've said, and each time they stung. Suddenly I was in the shoes of the other side. I was my partner, not me, and I was hearing what I sounded like to him. Something we've all heard is you'd never say the things you say to yourself to your friends, and it's of course true. But when you're in the throes of deep-rooted self-hatred, that doesn't matter. You justify why you're the exception to the rule. Sure, it would be horrible to say to others, but those others aren't bad like you. You are the one despicable person worthy of such foul words. You aren't worthy of love, and to tell yourself otherwise is a crime. You are ugly, fat, disgusting, a waste of space. This is what it is like inside of my head and inside of the head of Ivy. Now, I want to make it clear that my partner is nothing like Joe Davis. The only similarities are what the player can choose, dialogue options that make him sound much more supportive and loving than I believe he is. As I said earlier, many of his dialogue options are horrific yet persistent. They aren't one-offs, and in some cases, you're only given the choice between bad and worse. From the very beginning, you can tell your wife that she's insane and that she ruins everything. This is likely how Joe feels inside. He sees his wife's problems as something to fix, something to extinguish to get back the version of her he fell in love with, which incidentally is represented by another character in the game. His wanting to help her is less about her well-being and more about him having her exactly how he wants her. He seems incapable of understanding that true love involves loving someone with all their flaws. There are several aspects of this game I thoroughly enjoyed uncovering and figuring out, like what rooms in Quiet Haven Hotel represented or actually were rooms in the apartment house he lived in, like the basement is his kitchen, something given away by the chef's coat, the incinerator, it's really his stove, and the emaciated statue sitting down in the foreground. When you switch off the lights, you see the shadow of someone moving back and forth in an odd and almost struggling manner. And when you realize what this is, it might just ruin your day, but it does confirm this to be his kitchen. Again, Ivy has bulimia. It is hinted at that her mother put her on diets, and this is where it started. But regardless of the origin, the problem has persisted for most of her life. Ivy confesses that the women in the magazines and on TV make her feel disgusting. She wants to be beautiful. She reiterates that she is a size 12 and how awful that is to her. Joe promises to help Ivy through this problem, but how he does that is disturbing, to say the least. As we progress through the game, we can see he's chained up the bathroom to keep her from going in and making herself sick. In the kitchen, there is a chair chained to the floor and a plate of rotting food. The man was force-feeding his wife and locking her out of the bathroom. From what I can tell, Joe's wife likely starved herself to death. When her body is found in the end, it is emaciated, and the cat lady wonders if it was Joe starving her, but actually, it was the opposite. He tortured his wife by force-feeding her and keeping her chained to a chair in the kitchen, and the most heartbreaking thing is she probably felt like she deserved that treatment. There is a scene in The Cat Lady where Susan breaks into Joe's apartment, finding his bathroom door with chains on it, a hole in his floor leading down into the vacant apartment below his, and a few other disturbing things. Susan has a strange encounter in the dream/otherworld with Joe, and he immediately frightens her. Just his presence puts her on edge. But there is one thing he says here that I believe is extremely important and tells us exactly how he treated his wife and her illness in reality. This isn't Ivy. This isn't my wife. It's a monster. So you might wonder, how can one sympathize with a character who does this? Well, if you can manage to overlook how bad of a person Joe is, which is very difficult considering his actions and gameplay even without the revelations of how he handled his wife's illness, what you see is a man who loves someone with a mental illness. At first, he wanted to help, but when the normal routes failed, he turned to obsessiveness and ultimately created a fantasy to justify his monstrous acts. But again, ignoring that, you are given a glimpse into how it feels to love someone who hates themselves, to see someone you care so deeply for and so much pain is unbearable. Years of therapy and meds have never quite helped my perspective clear up, but lots of art, from books to video games and everything in between, have. I'm not a happy or sane person. I am the opposite. I carry what is often described as a blue mood, and my mind tends to focus on the harsh realities rather than the silver linings. I am disturbed. And art that is made to comfort people like me also has the power to change people like me, to make us feel a little less alone, maybe teach us something about the world and ourselves, and to change us for the better in the process. If you think I'm crediting video games a little too much, just take a look at the massive response people have had to something like Nier Automata. In the end, Downfall offered up an obvious truth and taught me that I need to fix a lifelong problem. My partner and I have been together for years now. We spend every day together. We've been through some absolute shit and have both grown in the process. I, for one, know that I am a better person today because of him. I've learned, changed, and grown an enormous amount since he and I have been together. Today, we barely have any problems and generally have a happy, healthy relationship. Unfortunately, this wasn't always the case. There was a time period when my self-loathing and psychosis worked in tandem to loudly tear me down from the inside out. This affected others around me, most especially my partner. He held on during my darkest days and managed to shine a light where I'd never seen any before. My partner showed me he understood me. He extended empathy and compassion when I felt I didn't deserve it, and he stood by through thick and thin. But even after our relationship problems disappeared, I still felt a deep sense of despair. I still felt I didn't deserve him. I still felt I made everything worse. I still felt I shouldn't be in a relationship because I'm too crazy. I had this belief that I should spend the rest of my life in isolation as to avoid hurting anyone else. And those feelings gnawed at me, making me a very depressing person to be around. I was hurting my partner whenever I talked about how ugly or undeserving of love I was. Sure, I wasn't starting dumb fights or being a bitch all the time, but I was basically telling him he was wrong for loving me and for being with me. So, what changed? In 2020, I played Death Stranding and then Nier Automata. These games taught me the importance of sacrifice and forging connections with others. They taught me to reevaluate my negative outlook, to appreciate the breath in my lungs, but more importantly, they taught me how important my bond with my partner was. Since playing those two games, my outlook has slowly changed to be much more understanding and, well, kinder to others. Sometimes, we have problems we don't even know exist. Downfall caught me off guard. It T-boned me at 80 miles an hour in an intersection. When I heard Joe say, "You're not even fat," to Ivy during a flashback, I physically winced. When I heard Ivy express confusion about her mental state, I almost cried. And when she asked, "Why do you love me?" I had to sit back and think over how many times I'd asked that very question, not in some cute way, but in the same confused, distraught manner Ivy was asking it. She genuinely couldn't imagine someone loving her the way she is, just like I couldn't. And it dawned on me that I was Ivy, a mentally ill person who hates themselves so much they cannot fathom anyone else caring for them, and especially not loving them. And those words she spoke hurt Joe just like when I spoke those words to my partner. When it comes to Downfall, my response upon finishing this game was, I can't be that person anymore. I can't tell myself I don't deserve love when I am clearly loved. That isn't a thought I'd ever had before. The writing in this game puts you in a strange position, in the shoes of a monster, a devil, who denies his nature and spins delusions upon delusions to justify his horrendous actions. And to my amazement, this game managed to make me feel sympathy for the devil.